Welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, August 21st. My name is Pam. Let's begin. In Kamala Harris's richly textured background, A Portrait of America Today by Harry Bernices in New York. Usha Haley was surprised at the depth of her own reaction when she heard that Senator Kamala Harris would be the Democratic Party's nominee for vice president. An accomplished economist whose centrist politics sometimes tend to the right, Dr. Haley says her response was really an emotional one, since there are a number of policy positions she does not share with the former California Attorney General. But as a religious Hindu and Indian American who has been married to an Irish Catholic man for 35 years, she saw in Senator Harris's life many of the same facets of her own, not only as a woman of color and an immigrant, but also as someone in an interfaith and culturally mixed family. I just felt elated in a way that's hard to explain, says Dr. Haley, who holds the W. Frank Barton Distinguished Chair of International Business at Wichita State University in Kansas. I tweeted everyone I knew, and I even called my mother, who lives in India. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden has said he views himself as a transition candidate who would bring a new generation of leaders into his administration. His decision to tap as his running mate the first black woman and person of Asian descent to appear on a major party's presidential ticket is a nod to the growing diversity that now defines the Democratic Party and the complexity behind those specific identities, namely Senator Harris's multicultural and interfaith background reflects a growing reality for many Americans as the country becomes less white, less Protestant, and less defined by organized religion in general. She is something that many of us now are, says Samira Ameda, a professor of women and gender studies and Jewish studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She is a person who has navigated a complicated multi-religious landscape and has then identified with a specific community, even while drawing from and incorporating other aspects of her life into that identity as a Black American. The senator's mother, the late biologist Shamala Gopalan, was an immigrant from India and a Hindu who married Jamaican-born scholar and Stanford economist Donald Harris. Senator Harris is now married to Los Angeles attorney Douglas Emhoff, a Jewish man from Brooklyn. In an increasingly common portrait since 2010, nearly 5 of 10 Americans who have married have joined a spouse of a different religious group, according to Pew Research 2015 Religious Landscape Study, doubling the percentage of interfaith marriages 50 years ago. Overall, about 20% of U.S. adults today say they were raised in a mixed religious household. Just by her experience of navigating these many different religious identities, not to mention different cultural identities, Kamala Harris had real-life practice in what it means to be part of the American interfaith experiment, says Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch, Senior Advisor for Public Affairs and Innovation at Interfaith Youth Corps, which partners with U.S. colleges and universities to foster interfaith cooperation and leaders in an increasingly pluralistic society. In some ways, she represents a very time-old American tradition of different people coming together to meet one another in a new location and forging something new, continues Mr. Rauschenbusch, whose great-grandfathers include the famous Protestant theologian Walter Rauschenbusch, who pioneered the social gospel movement, and Louis Brandeis, a Jewish Supreme Court justice and one of the nation's most influential legal minds. Over the course of her career, Senator Harris has not always emphasized her culturally mixed background. She said that she never put too much thought into how to categorize herself and has never liked being wedged into this box or that box of racial or ethnic groups, preferring to call herself a proud American. A number of her friends told the Washington Post that they were even aware that she had a heritage from South Asia. Typo. When I first ran for office, That was one of the things that I struggled with, she said in 2019. You are forced through that process to define yourself in a way that you fit neatly into a compartment that other people have created. Despite the different traditions informing her background, in many ways the Democratic vice presidential nominee simply sees herself as a Black American. After her parents divorced when she was a young girl, her mother raised her and her younger sister Maya within the Black middle-class communities in Oakland. From almost the moment she arrived from India, she chose and was welcomed to and enveloped into the Black community. Senator Harris wrote of her mother in her 2019 memoirs, The Truths We Hold. It was a foundation of her new American life. My mother understood very well that she was raising two Black daughters, she wrote. She knew that her adopted homeland would see Maya and me as Black girls, and she was determined to make sure we would grow into confident, proud Black women. Both her parents enveloped them in civil rights activities, protests, and salon-like social gatherings where adults devoured Black writers overlooked in their educations, including Ralph Ellison, Carter G. Woodson, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Her mother exposed her daughters to her Hindu faith, bringing them to India on numerous occasions to meet their extended relatives and experience Hindu worship. But she also decided to ground her daughters in Christianity, sending them each Sunday with a family friend to attend Oakland's 23rd Avenue Church of God, a denomination with Pentecostal roots, where they sang in the children's choir. My early memories of the teaching of the Bible were of a loving God, a God who asks us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and to defend the rights of the poor and needy. Senator Harris wrote in her memoir, "This is what I learned, that faith is a verb. I believe we must live our faith and show faith in action." Such grounding in the Bay Area Black communities led her to travel east to attend college at Howard University in Washington, D.C., the historically Black university with a rich tradition of legal scholarship and civil rights activism. This was a very significant decision, says Diane Pender Hughes, a professor of political science and Africana studies at the University of Notre Dame. Since both Senator Harris's parents, as well as her sister Maya, received degrees from the University of California in Berkeley. Responding, she chose to set out on her own to go to Howard, wanting to be closer to its traditions in the law and become a lawyer, like Justice Thurgood Marshall, a Howard alum whom Senator Harris has called one of the inspirations of her youth. And she didn't just attend Howard, she became very much a part of its social networks, Dr. Pender Hughes added. Responding to persistent questions about her Blackness as the daughter of two foreign-born American immigrants, including birther, questions about her eligibility for the presidency that have gained new traction on the right despite having no legal basis, Senator Harris says during a radio interview last year, "I'm Black and I'm proud of being Black." But it's the various threads woven into the tapestry of that identity that makes Senator Harris's experience increasingly relatable to many. Dr. Haley, for example, navigates her own family's traditions in a fluid way, saying her Sanskrit prayers in the morning, but also attending Roman Catholic Mass with her husband and 5-year-old daughter. With our child, she's exposed to both, and I'm hoping to expose her to Buddhism and Judaism as well, because we're friends with people from so many different walks, she says. Dr. Maida has had a similar experience. Her father's family's background is steeped in Hindu traditions, but her mother was part of a complicated Jewish family that included Presbyterian converts and members of the Unitarian congregation. "So I grew up a little kid celebrating both Diwali, the Hindu festival of lights, and Passover," says the University of Colorado Boulder scholar whose book Beyond Chrismukkah, Christian-Jewish Interfaith Families in the United States, explores the long history of such families. She ultimately decided to embrace her Jewish roots, formally convert, and become a scholar in the field of Jewish studies. I would say identity is still a lot more complicated than simply a collection of ethnic or religious fractions. It's also a part of the choice you make. For Mr. Rauschenbusch, the process of shaping an identity is enhanced by interfaith experiences, even when grounded in specific communities or traditions. That part of what Kamala Harris represents, regardless of politics, he said. We are invited to a closer proximity with people who are, very different than ourselves. This next article is titled, Feeling Betrayed by UAE Palestinians Seek to Redefine Struggle by Taylor Luck. In Amman, Jordan. Betrayal, tragedy, a stab in the back. Palestinians have used many anguished phrases over the past week to describe the brewing normalization deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. But one clearly defines where they find themselves, a crossroad. For Palestinians, the UAE-Israel agreement looms as more than just a blow to Arab unity and their quest for statehood, but as a reckoning for their leadership and a final nail in the coffin of the Oslo peace process. Feeling alienated by Arab allies, the United States and the international community, Palestinians are seeking to redefine their struggle with a renewed sense of urgency. What is percolating up from the grassroots also is a desire for a dramatic move away from conventional demands and diplomacy and a reliance on their political leadership. Instead of peace or even statehood, the rising buzzwords among Palestinians on the street and among activists are rights and resistance. The UAE-Israel deal upending decades of Arab consensus that Arab states would withhold normalization with Israel and its associated economic and diplomatic benefits until after a comprehensive peace deal for an independent Palestinian state that included Israel's withdrawal from lands it captured in 1967. The consensus, formalized by Saudi Arabia in the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, was used by Arabs and Palestinians as an incentive for Israel and the international community to stick to the peace process and the two-state solution. With the UAE, a regional heavyweight and one of the wealthiest Arab states, now violating that consensus, observers and officials say the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinians are diplomatically and politically isolated. Further, the deal is evidence that the Palestinians' tactic of shaming Arab players who attempt normalization, previously successful in constraining Israel's peace with Jordan and Egypt and pushing Israel-Gulf cooperation behind closed doors, no longer works. Anger at the leadership. Predictably, the announcement last week ignites protests in Gaza, Jerusalem, and Ramallah, with protesters accusing the UAE of treason and burning photos of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed on the streets and on social media. Slogans echoed one call: normalization is betrayal. It is also seen as a mortal wound to the Palestinian Authority, which is faulted for its costly pursuit of a now moribund peace process and which, after being snubbed by the Trump administration, had clung to Arab support as its strongest remaining card. Simply, the peace process is a failed framework. The PA under President Mohammed Abbas has solely focused on negotiations and more negotiations when it was clear he should have changed strategy a long time ago, says activist Diana Boutou, a former PLO spokeswoman. Negotiations were simply a tactic, never a true strategy, and now they do not even have the Arabs with them. They have nothing. Saeb Erekat, negotiator and Secretary General of the PLO Executive Committee, addressed the internal Palestinian debate in an email interview. Not all Palestinians think the same, and that's a good thing. But there is an overwhelming consensus when it comes to ending the Israeli occupation, he says. Is the Oslo peace process taking us from occupation to independence, or is it being used to perpetuate the status quo of occupation and apartheid? This is the real question that has to be answered. Even before the UAE deal, Palestinian support for their leaders was in decline. According to a late June survey by the Ramallah-based Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, 81% of Palestinians perceived the PA as corrupt, 52% saw it as a burden, and 62% demanded the resignation of the aging Mr. Abbas, whose mandate ended in 2009. On social media and on the street, Palestinians also point to their leadership's refusal to reform or include a younger generation. The last legislative elections for the Palestinian Authority were held in 2006. The POL itself had not had internal elections since 1990s. We are in a place where we can no longer say that the strategy pursued by the PLO 27 years ago in Oslo is legitimate, and it is impossible for people to say that this Palestinian leadership is legitimate, says Ms. Boutou. Topic: abandoning Oslo and statehood. For a generation that has grown up in a post-Oslo era of restrictions, security walls, expanding settlements, and home demolitions, the Israel-UAE deal has accelerated an evolving shift in thought on the two-state solution and a peace process many now say was dictated to them. According to the June survey, nearly 2 out of 3 Palestinians, 63%, believe the two-state solution is no longer practical or feasible, and half oppose it. Only 45% express support for the two states. Additional surveys show 1/3 of Palestinians supporting one state with equal rights, despite not a single Palestinian faction promoting the concept. The discourse is becoming less about this standard vision of a purely Palestinian state with particular borders and more about pushing for self-determination and sovereignty, whatever form that takes, says Dana El-Kurd, an assistant professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. It could be a binational state or a federation. There are different potential versions, she adds. But having sovereignty and self-determination at the crux of your demands means rejecting carving up Palestine into isolated islands inside Israeli-controlled territory. That's true no matter if the international community is playing a role or not. Palestinian activists and observers say they will increasingly turn to popular resistance to express their demands. Such resistance would go beyond economic boycotts and could include general strikes, mass demonstrations, and disruptions to daily life in Israel and the Palestinian territories to put the media spotlight on their struggle. Palestinians have learned a lot from popular resistance as a tool to convince the international community that they are the ones who want change and should be addressed, not other Arab states or undemocratic bodies such as the PA, who no longer represents them, says Najema Ali, a Palestinian researcher and analyst. A recent precedent would be the mass mobilization of Palestinians in Jerusalem in 2017, which prompted Israel to walk back a move to place security cameras at the entrances to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Activists say such coordination harks back to the first Intifada in 1988. On social media, Palestinians have pledged to physically prevent Emirates. It's Emirates. Okay, I'm sorry. Lost my place. On social media, Palestinians have pledged to physically prevent Emirates from entering Jerusalem's Old City or to pray in Al-Aqsa, one of the Islam's holiest sites. Palestinians also are reaching out to activists in the Gulf to organize joint action to pressure other Arab states not to follow the UAE's lead. Some Palestinian institutions have read the anger and are racing to get out in front. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Sheikh Mohammed Ahmed Hussein, warns Arabs Tuesday that it is not permissible for any Muslim to come through normalization processes to visit Al-Aqsa. Regional clout. Nevertheless, the UAE's clout in the region is already being felt. On Wednesday, a Sudanese foreign ministry spokesman said Khartoum Khartoum, heavily influenced by Abu Dhabi, is open to entering into peace talks with Israel, and rumors rumble in some Arab capitals that Bahrain will soon follow. The Arab League has refused to hold an emergency session or even issue a statement on the UAE-Israel deal, despite several petitions by the Palestinian Authority, reportedly due to Emirati pressure. Arab states allied with the UAE have been urged to repress any domestic public criticism of Abu Dhabi and Israel in their home countries, despite their own citizens' outrage and personal misgivings. Arab and Palestinian officials privately admit another weakness: the presence of over 200,000 Palestinians who live and work in the UAE and a further 200,000 across the Gulf. Palestinian leaders and commentators are wary that strong words or protests could lead to the mass expulsion of Palestinians from the Gulf, a blow to families and the economy. Gulf Palestinians' remittances back home account for 16% of the Palestinian territory's GDP. Today, the UAE has mobilized all its propaganda tools, including some vicious anti-Palestinian comments and censorship of anti-agreement voices, including ours that they are suppressed to be helping, Mr. Erekat said, noting that the Palestinian leadership has been reassured by other Arab states that they will not follow Abu Dhabi's lead. Wednesday evening, Fatah and its rivals, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, began discussions for coordinated mass protests to keep up with the grassroots call for mobilization. In this new phase, without the support of Arab states or with the international community, Palestinians say they are increasingly ready to take matters into their own hands. Palestinians on the ground feel like they are stuck and backed into a corner by every party, says Dr. Ali, the analyst. The only response will be to push back and act, and at this time it will come from the grassroots and not from above. Our next article is titled, How Richmond Plans to Remove Its Robert E. Lee Statue by Dennis Lavoie, Associated Press, in Richmond, Virginia. When the bronze equestrian statue of General Robert E. Lee arrived by rail in Richmond from Paris in 1890, it took 10,000 men, women, and children to haul its pieces more than a mile to the site where the towering monument was erected as a tribute to the Confederate hero. Now, 130 years later, conservation experts who plan to relocate yet preserve the statue face the intricate logistics of disassembling and transporting it to a storage facility. They must also ensure worker safety amid heated public debate over whether the statue is an important piece of Southern heritage or a symbol of white supremacy and racism. Virginia Governor Ralph Northam announced plans to remove the 13-ton sculpture in June after the death of George Floyd sparked a nationwide protest movement over racial inequality and police brutality. Mr. Floyd, a black man, died in May after a white Minneapolis police officer put his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for several minutes. The plan to remove the monument, an imposing 21-foot-tall bronze likeness of General Lee on a horse that sits atop a granite pedestal nearly twice that high, has been halted at least temporarily by a lawsuit. But Mr. Northam has vowed to quickly take down the state-owned statue if and when a judge lifts an injunction barring its removal. Now covered by graffiti, the Lee Monument has become the epicenter of the protest movement in Richmond, a former capital of the Confederacy that has moved slowly in shedding vestiges of the past. 4 other city-owned Confederate statues on Richmond's historical Monument Avenue were taken down last month in response to sometimes violent protests. B.R. Howard Conservation, a Pennsylvania company that specializes in art conservation and historic preservation projects, has developed a plan that calls for removing 16 bronze pins to separate the statue from its base, removing the harness and reins of General Lee's horse, then attaching padded straps and using a crane to lift it and lower it to the ground. A 100-ton crane brought in from Connecticut was used to remove large statues of Confederate generals J.E.B. Stuart and Stonewall Jackson, said Paul Di Pasquale, a sculptor who designed and built Richmond's monument to black tennis legend Arthur Ashe, and served as a consultant on the removal of the Stewart and Jackson statues. A similarly large crane is expected to be used to take down the Lee statue. Because of its enormous size, the statue will then be cut into 3 pieces so that it can fit under highway overpasses with height restrictions of between 13.5 to 14 feet as it is taken to an undisclosed storage site. The Northam administration has said it will seek public input on the statue's future. Mr. Di Pasquale said taking down the statue could present some challenges, but can be done safely while preserving the artistic integrity of the sculpture, one of the largest and most recognizable Confederate statues in the United States. Lifting it is a challenge, where to cut it is a challenge, and then how to load it. You want it to travel safely, he said. Mr. Di Pasquale said there is a strong public interest in witnessing the monuments come down because of the historical significance and symbolism of removing Confederate icons. Once removed, it severs the history of why it's been there and why it's coming down, he said. That is a milestone in our cultural experience, and I think whether it's conscious or not, that's why people want it to be there. The plan calls for cutting the statue along existing folds and seams to minimize any damage. Based on written accounts describing the assembly of the sculpture in 1890, the first section to be cut will include the cast base and the legs of Lee's horse, the second section of the body and head of the horse, and the third the figure of General Lee from the waist up. The conservator recommends putting up a partition so that the work can be done away from the view of the public for their safety and the protection of the crew. Confederate monument removals have provoked high tension elsewhere in the U.S. In New Orleans, contractors involved in the removal of the city's Confederate monuments in 2017 faced threats. They often wore bulletproof vests, helmets, and face coverings to shield their identities as the work took place, sometimes in the overnight hours. Then Mayor Mitch Landrieu proposed the monument's removal after the 2015 massacre of 9 black parishioners at a South Carolina church by a gunman who was an avowed racist and brandished Confederate battle flags in photos. B.R. Howard has a separate plan for disassembling the Lee Monument's 40-foot-high pedestal, which may contain a time capsule, although Mr. Northam's administration has not yet made a decision about that part of the monument. The plans call for photographing or creating a 3-dimensional scan of the pedestal. An inventory will be done to identify and locate hundreds of granite blocks and carved decorative elements. Then, workers will cut mortar joints to separate the individual pieces. All of the disassembled granite blocks will be placed on pallets and layered with padding to protect them during relocation and storage. The Lee statue was created by an internationally renowned French sculptor, Marius Jean Antonin Mercier, and is considered a masterpiece according to its nomination to the National Register of Historic Places, where it has been listed since 2007. This last article is entitled Defying Expectations. Monitor readers share women who inspired them by Amelia Newcomb. Title, Unbounded by Gender Discrimination. Tiny, smart, loving, and resilient, my grandmother was widowed with 2 small children, worked to support them, remarried in World War II, lost her son and second husband to the war, kept her business going despite a radical surgery, and is an icon to me. My father had only 1 child, and he raised me to be his son and daughter, so I often did not see gender barriers because I did not expect to see them. I have succeeded because of the love unbounded by gender discrimination that these 2 gave. Jill Manila of the Philippines. Next one, I'm going to become more like a nomad. When I was studying nomadic societies in college, I found their lifestyle so interesting and important for humanity and for the future of our planet. I told my sister, I'm going to become more like a nomad. I went and learned from nomads in Mongolia, Niger, and now in southern Africa. In the process, I discovered how to live without property, an anathema at times for a 40-year-old woman. Julie Snorrick Hanover from New Hampshire. Our next commentary, Quiet as a Career. My mother, Marguerite Bridget Gallagher, was born in 1913 in St. James, Beaver Island, and archipelago of Irish diaspora in the middle of Lake Michigan. The first of her family of 5 siblings to leave the island and the only one to gain a college education, she followed my dad, a naval officer, to Long Beach, California during World War II. She was hired as a special assistant to the commander of the Naval Department responsible for the top secret codes governing fleet movements in South Pacific. Following the war, she raised 3 sons and ultimately settled into a newspaper publishing career. It was quite a career for a woman whose family begged her not to leave the security of their island. Gregory P. Smith, Traverse City, Michigan. And the last one, defied social norms for women in the 19th century. My grandmother, Kate Pellett Cease, was born in 1893 and defied social norms for women in the 19th century. She was a fisherwoman, well known at a lake in Canada for her big catches, and she was a ballet dancer in Paris with her sister. During the Great Depression, she was entering a bank to cash a check when a man with a gun stopped her to rob her of her money. She told him she had to cash a check and would be back, and left the bank by another door. By Katie Sue Brown, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Well, friends, that concludes this Friday's reading of the Christian Science Monitor. This is Pam saying please stay in, stay safe, and be blessed.